the OC.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, would you like to do shared time or would you like to do block time?
Yeah, I'll start from that.
Shared or block time, Minister?
Oh, sorry, block time.
Okay, thank you. As we know, for women to leave and not return to abusive homes, having economic independence is crucial. Page 41 of the business plan, Objective 1.6 mentions addressing affordability concerns and providing financial supports to eligible Alberta families and children. So I'm curious, if we are addressing affordability and wanting women to be economically independent and resilient as a cost-saving measure and preventative work, what is your ministry doing to advocate for increasing the minimum wage and pay equity? In page 26 of the 27 strategic plan on page 22, priority 2, objective 5, supporting vulnerable Albertans, it states that the government is preventing gender-based violence through awareness, education, community engagement. The government is supporting the implementation of a 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence and support survivors. Within the 26-27 business plan, outcome 3, key objective 3.1 is a coordinated implementation of the Alberta's 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence. Within that plan, on page 6, the report states that to improve the quality of life for all Albertans, it is a shared reflected commitment across the government to end gender-based violence. And I truly actually do appreciate the coordinated approach and the implementation of this cross-ministry strategy to end gender-based violence. So referring to page 28 of the 26-27 business plan, how much of the $15.7 million is allocated to this ministry, in the implementation of the 10-year GBV plan? How much money went into the creation of the Alberta 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence? Where in the budget documents does it show the total cost to implement and pay for this plan? Can the minister confirm that the $19 million allocated to the gender-based prevention is allocated from his ministry to other ministries for implementation? Can the minister list which of other ministries have been allocated this funding and how much was allocated to them? Can the minister confirm if there are any performance metrics for us to use in, are there any performance metrics for the use of this funding, and if so, what are they? And if not, why? Will the minister provide this information to me in writing if they're not available today? With the implementation of this cross-ministry strategy, what formal coordination is in place between the Children and Family Services and other ministries for Albertans whose needs go beyond the narrow family violence funding stream? Has the ministry created any clear referral or funding pathways for shelter-serving clients whose needs overlap with housing, addiction, mental health, immigration, or other issues? If the shelters are being told to seek other funding streams, which ministries are expected to pick up those unmet needs? In the 24-25 annual report, it showed shelter pressures increasing, with longer stays linked to increased client complexities, safety considerations, housing costs, or the lack of affordable housing options and transition into. The business plan key objective 1.4 on page 35, the ministry refers to reviewing and updating the investments in the women's shelter programming. Can the minister explain what has changed in this budget to ensure shelter funding is better aligned with the actual pressures shelters are facing? The annual report showed that women are staying longer in emergency shelters, in part because of housing pressures. Where in the budget documents can I find the specific funding or program changes that are intended to reduce those longer shelter stays? With increasing complexity, what additional support is being provided for staffing, programming, and wraparound services beyond just shelter beds? In the business plan, page 42, key objective 2.5, it refers to renewed shelter programming and funded community-based supports. Can the minister explain what measures the ministry will use in 26-27 to show whether those investments are actually reducing pressures in the shelter system? How much is coming as stable operating funding to frontline GBV organizations versus short-term projects, grants? What is the plan to move them to multi-year funding? Stakeholders have consistently raised concerns about short-term and one-time funding. One-year grants do not allow for meaningful long-term programming or evaluation. They are causing a lot of instability. Has the minister heard from shelter directors that short grant timelines make budgeting and planning unmanageable? And if so, what changes are going to be made in response to this? In the current business plan, what portion of women's shelters and sexual violence funding is stable operational base funding, and what portion remains one-time, short-term and project-based. Can the minister explain how the 26-27 budget gives shelters and community agencies the stability to plan for staffing and services over multiple years when they're relying on short-term grants? Will the renewed Women's Shelter Program provide multi-year operational funding, or are shelters still expected to work under short-term grant agreements? What metrics is the ministry using to judge success for the programs that are funded for only 1 year and may not continue? How will the ministry make sure that the smaller shelters without large advocacy teams are not disadvantaged in seeking additional funding or capacity? Where is the planning to give shelters enough stability to plan staffing, programming, and capacity in long term? Does the ministry see these 1-year gender-based violence grants as pilot projects? And if so, what process exists to continue or scale successful ones? In the government estimates, page 74, 4.3, it states that women's shelters provide safe accommodation for women and children in crisis due to family violence and help connect them with resources they need to rebuild their lives. Are shelters now being told that provincial funding will apply only to beds or services for clients who meet a narrower family violence definition? If so, what is the definition? How is the ministry expecting shelters to support clients who do not fit that definition but still need shelter and safety? Is the ministry's position that domestic violence funded beds should never be used for women facing other urgent safety and housing crises? Are shelters now to find separate grants or other funding streams to cover those clients? If the ministry is funding only part of the shelter's actual demand, what plan is in place to make sure those women and children are not simply left without support? Stakeholders are hearing that there will be a new implementation of new shelter funding approach. Can the ministry confirm whether the implementation of the new shelter funding approach was delayed from April 1st to July 1st? Or do the 25-26 grants extended to July 1st with the rest of the year still uncertain? How are the shelters supposed to budget for a full year when they don't have confirmed funding? Did the ministry assess the risk that these short-term extensions could lead to staffing instability, service reductions, and delayed planning? Why was the ministry not in position to provide full-year clarity before the start of the fiscal year? Last year's budget promised shelters a $19 million addition funding that they are still waiting on. Many stakeholders are wondering where the money went. I don't see it referred to at all in the ministry's 26-27 budget or business plan. When they asked this ministry, they were referred to the status of women, and they still don't have an allocation breakdown. Was the entire $19 million allocated over the 3 years been spent? If so, what did the funding go to, and where were the tangible outcomes? Was the $19 million used to create the Alberta 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence? With Alberta's agreement with the federal government, we have received $7 million in transfers in the 25-26 and 26-27 for gender-based violence prevention and related social policy funding. The federal gender-based violence prevention funding peaked in the 23-24, and the federal funding is now declining as the federal agreement expires. So on page 30 of the business plan is related to federal cost-shared agreements for the gender-based violence prevention and related social policy funding. What provincial dollars is being spent to end gender-based violence? Can the ministry outline what actions taken to identify additional funding or other funding sources to ensure the continuing of funding for prevention of gender-based violence after the federal funding ends? What contingencies has the minister accounted for should the federal funding be lost for either those of separatism question or other reasons? Can the ministry outline what actions are being taken to identify alternative or additional sources of funding to ensure that the community of prevention of gender-based violence should federal funding cease to exist? The government ended the Family Violence Death Review Committee, a body that reviewed deaths related to family violence, identified patterns of risk factor, and made recommendations to help prevent future deaths. The government said that that work was to become redundant because of the other review bodies and newer initiatives. So I want to ask very clearly what in this year's budget replaces that work. Which branch, unit, or funded initiative is now responsible for reviewing deaths linked to family violence? Which body there to identify patterns of systematic failures and family violence-related deaths? Why did the government think that it was acceptable to remove one of the few mechanisms specifically focused on family violence death while also claiming the prevention as a top priority? The government has said that this change allows for resources to be directed to frontline work. Was any of that money transferred into prevention of family and sexual violence? into the gender-based violence strategy, women's shelter renewal, or community-based violence supports? What metric in this year's business plan tells Albertans that this ministry is still learning from family violence-related deaths and using that information to prevent future ones?
Thank you so much, member. We'll move back over to the minister for his response.